This series of videos will examine the structure of the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is a transport system that carries blood and lymph to and from the tissues of the body. In fact, blood is carried to and from the tissues, whereas lymph is a one-way system, only from the tissues back to the vasculature. The components include the heart, the blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels. This overview diagram demonstrates that there are two distinct portions of the circulation. First, the systemic circulation, which goes from the heart to the arteries, the microvascular, the venous circulation back to the heart, and then the pulmonary circulation, which goes from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. So let's begin with looking at the heart. We looked at cardiac muscle last time, which essentially is a portion of the heart. The heart overall is a muscular pump that maintains unidirectional blood flow. It has 4 chambers, it has a series of valves, its main muscular component is cardiac muscle, and then it has various connective tissue coverings. It also has a fibrous skeleton and an impulse conduction system. The fibrous skeleton is comprised of 4 fibrous rings that are made of dense irregular connective tissue. They meet at areas called trigones, which you can see in the diagram to the right. There's a fibrous core of membranous septa between each one of these dense rings. The fibrous skeleton has several functions. First, it provides an attachment site for the leaflets and myocardium. Second, it extends into the intravesicular septum. And third, it provides electrical insulation. The heart impulse conduction system consists of the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle and branches, and the Purkinje fibers. We will be able to look at these Purkinje fibers in more detail, both in this presentation and in laboratory. The heart wall can be spoken of in the same way that you look at the vessel walls, as a structure with 3 distinct layers. Starting at the outer layer, we have the epicardium, which is comprised of mesothelial cells, a small amount of connective tissue, vessels, nerves, and fat. Underneath that, you have the myocardium, which is comprised of the cardiac muscle. And interior to that, next to the actual chambers of the heart, is the endocardium, which has the endothelial layer and some fibroelastic connective tissue, and in certain areas, Purkinje fibers, which were just mentioned as part of the conduction system of the heart. Here's an actual picture of the histology of the heart wall. You can see on the far left the epicardium, which has, appears to be mostly a fatty layer. Then the myocardium, which is in this case part of the ventricle. And then just right next to the lumen inside the heart, you can see the endocardial layer. So let's take another look at these Purkinje fibers. The ventricular wall is in both of these images at the top, and it's lined by a simple squamous epithelia. Like all blood vessels, the heart can be considered just a dilated blood vessel. Underlying that, there's some connective tissue, and then underneath that, in both of these images, you can see these very large, pale staining fibers here in the H and E, and over here in this trichome stain. Now remember, trichome stain, the connective tissue is this very blue stuff, so you can see the connective tissue fibers here. that run in and around all of ththese Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje fibers are not nerve fibers. They are modified cardiac muscle cells. They do have myofibers in them. Sorry, not myofibers, myofibrils in them. But their main function is conduction rather than contraction. They appear very pale staining because of the glycogen that fills their cytoplasm and then is kind of processed out during preparation for histology. In both cases, on the right on the H&E and on the left in the trichome stain, you can see portion of the myocardium or the cardiac muscle cells themselves. So as I mentioned when I looked at that overview diagram, the cardiac blood flow proceeds from the heart to the largest arteries, then to smaller arteries, then to what we call arterioles, then into the microvasculature, which is capillaries, after which you proceed into the smallest veins, which are called venules, proceeding to medium size and then larger veins, and eventually back to the heart. All of these vessels have certain features in common, which we're going to examine in detail. So you can think of these vessel walls as having three main layers. The most interior, next to the lumen, is called the tunica intima. Outside that, the tunica media, the middle layer, and outside that, the tunica adventitia. Each of these tunics has characteristic features, and we can classify the different vessels based on the abundance or lack of certain features in the different vessels. So let's do an overview of each of these tunics and then compare them from one type of vessel to another. So the intima, or tunica intima, right next to the lumen always has simple squamous epithelial cells called endothelial cells, which have an underlying basal lamina. In most vessels, there's also a small layer of loose connective tissue, and in certain vessels, especially on the arterial side, there's a lamina of elastic tissue called the internal elastic lamina, which is the dividing line between the intima and media. The tunica media contains smooth muscle, and those cells do in fact make a lot of the extracellular matrix material that you find in that area, including collagen, reticular fibers, proteoglycans, elastic fibers, if you have a lot of elastic tissue as in an artery, and oftentimes something called an external elastic lamina. The outermost layer, the adventitia, is usually populated by fibroblasts, and those make collagenous connective tissue and some elastic fibers. It is in that location that larger vessels will also have their own small vessels called vasa vasorum, or the vessels of the vessel. You will also find small nerve fascicles called the nervi vascularis in this region. And in the very largest of veins and vessels, you might find more smooth muscle oriented instead of around the lumen that you see in the media, you would see it longitudinally oriented along the vessel. So, the types of blood vessels include large elastic arteries, the aorta and its large branches really, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then large veins. The lymphatic vessels include lymphatic capillaries, of which lacteals is one type, lymphatic vessels of medium and large size, and then the largest lymphatics, such as the thoracic duct.